The neural interface felt less like a connection and more like a rusty nail driven straight into the base of his skull. Kalen Thorne screamed, but the sound died in his throat, choked off by the bile rising from his empty stomach. On the screens, the red blips of the Carrion Syndicate fleet were closing in, a pack of wolves circling a wounded animal. They wanted the ship. They wanted the salvage. They didn't care that the pilot inside was currently frying his own nervous system just to keep the reactor from stalling. His vision blurred, white spots dancing at the edges of his sight as the radiation warnings turned the cockpit into a strobe light of impending death. The reactor temperature gauge climbed past the red line. He wasn't fixing it. He was breaking it on purpose. If they want the prize, they can have the fallout, Kalen thought, his fingers locking into claws over the manual override lever. He could feel the heat bleeding through the deck plates, smelling the ozone of frying circuits and the copper tang of his own nosebleed. He wasn't a soldier. He was just a guy who ran out of options 3 systems back. He tightened his grip, his knuckles turning white, and yanked the safety limiter down until it snapped. The reactor roared, but before the radiation alarms drowned out the thudding of his own heartbeat, there was just the silence and the rust. 12 hours earlier, the only thing trying to kill him was the crushing debt hanging over his head and the corrosive gas of the Rust Nebula. Kalen sat slumped in the pilot's seat of the Bone Picker, a salvage rig that was more patch jobs than original haul. The nebula outside was a thick, bruised soup of ionized gas and metallic dust that chewed unshielding like acid. It was the kind of place where ships went to die, which made it the perfect place for a man like Kalen to hide. He rubbed his face with a grease-stained hand, the grit scratching against his stubble. The air recyclers were wheezing again, pumping out oxygen that tasted like stale pennies and burnt rubber. He checked the fuel gauge, 14%. He checked his credit chit, -3,000 standard units. The math was simple and cold. If he didn't find something worth scavenging in the next 6 hours, he wouldn't have the fuel to jump out of the system. And if he didn't jump, the debt collectors for the Vargas cartel would eventually find his transponder signal. They wouldn't kill him. Killing was too quick. They would take the Bone Picker, sell his organs to a Rimworld clinic, and leave him to rot in a gravity well. A warning chime pulled him out of the spiral. It wasn't a proximity alarm. It was the passive sonar, picking up a ghost. He leaned forward, the leather of his flight chair creaking under his weight. He adjusted the gain on the receiver, filtering out the static hiss of the nebula's magnetic storms. There it was again, a rhythm. Deep, low, and heavy. It didn't sound like a distress beacon. Beacons were desperate, high-pitched pleas for help. This was a growl. It was coming from the deep well, down near the crushing pressure zone of a gas giant that the nebula swirled around. Kalen hesitated. Going that deep was suicide for a rig like the Bone Picker. The pressure would test every weld on the hull. But the signal had a signature that made his stomach flip. High-density alloy resonance. Whatever was down there was big, massive. And if it was derelict, it was worth enough to clear his debt and buy a ticket to a core world where the air didn't taste like despair. He punched the coordinates in. "Don't die on me, you piece of junk," he muttered to the dashboard. The descent was brutal. The gas thickened, turning from a hazy orange to a suffocating violet brown. The ship groaned, the metal complaining under the increasing atmospheric weight. Kalen fought the stick, sweat beading on his forehead and stinging his eyes. The turbulence rattled his teeth, vibrating to the floor and up his legs until his muscles felt like jelly. He kept one eye on the hull integrity and the other on the sonar. The signal was getting louder, a thrumming vibration that he could feel in his chest cavity. Then, the clouds broke. Kalen slammed the thrusters into reverse, the G-force slamming him against the harness so hard it knocked the wind out of him. He stared out the viewport, his mouth dry as dust. It wasn't just a ship. It was a floating city of war. The vessel hung in the void, suspended in the eye of the storm. It was black, a matte, light-absorbing darkness that looked less like constructed metal and more like grown chitin. Scars raked across its flanks, massive, jagged trenches where plasma fire had boiled the armor away centuries ago. It was easily 5 kilometers long, a leviathan sleeping in the graveyard. The design was all wrong for the Terran Navy or even the old Imperial fleets. It was biomechanical, sharp angles blending into organic curves. Jackpot, Kalen breezed, though the word felt hollow. It felt less like finding a treasure chest and more like stumbling into a sleeping dragon's cave. He brought the bone picker around, searching for an airlock. The scale of the derelict made his rig look like a net buzzing around a rotting carcass. He found a breach near what looked like the engineering section, a jagged tear in the hull that had been sealed by emergency bulkheads, but with a manual override port still intact. He extended the docking tube. The magnetic clamps engaged with a heavy, dull thud that reverberated through the bone picker's frame. The connection light turned green. Kalen unbuckled, his legs stiff and shaky as he stood up. He grabbed his plasma cutter and his rebreather mask, checking the charge on his mag boots. The airlock cycle was loud, the hiss of pressure equalization sounding like a dying breath. When the inner door slid open, the smell hit him instantly. It wasn't the smell of rot or ozone or fuel. It was the smell of old, stagnant cold. It smelled like a tomb that had been sealed before history began. Kalen stepped inside, his mag boots clanking against the deck. The gravity here was erratic, tugging at him sideways one moment and then feeling normal the next, creating a nauseating sense of vertigo. The corridor ahead stretched into darkness, the walls lined with cable bundles that looked suspiciously like dried veins. He clicked on his shoulder light. The beam cut through the gloom, illuminating dust motes that hung motionless in the dead air. He wasn't alone. He could feel it. Not a presence exactly, but a weight. The ship was watching him. "Hello," he called out. The word died instantly, swallowed by the acoustic dampening of the walls. He checked his wrist scanner. The atmosphere was breathable but thin, high in nitrogen. He kept the mask on. He walked deeper, stepping over debris that looked like shattered pieces of obsidian. He needed to find the bridge, or the core. If he could pull the data logs, he could sell the location to the highest bidder. If he could salvage a few high-grade power couplings, he could eat for a year. But as he moved further into the belly of the beast, the corridor opened up into a massive atrium, and there, in the center, suspended by cables that pulsed with a faint, dying blue light, was the face. It wasn't a literal face, but a projection, a holographic construct, 3 stories tall, flickering and glitching. It was a woman's face, stylized and severe, her eyes closed. She was weeping. Tears of digital static ran down her cheeks, dissolving into pixels before they hit the virtual floor. Kalen stopped, his heart hammering against his ribs. This wasn't just a ship. It was a coffin, and the occupant was still awake. The static fizzled, a wet, snapping sound like dry wood breaking underfoot. Kalen didn't move. He barely breathed. The hologram towered over him, the weeping woman composed of jagged blue light and flickering data streams. She didn't look like a machine. She looked like a widow at a funeral. "Leave," the voice said. It didn't come from speakers. It vibrated directly into his jawbone, a subsonic thrum that made his teeth ache. "There is nothing here but dust." Kalen swallowed the copper taste in his mouth. He took a step forward, his mag boots crunching on the debris. "I'm not looking for dust," he said, his voice sounding thin and pathetic in the vast chamber. "I'm looking for a payout. Salvage rights. Your core is active. That makes you property." The avatar's eyes opened. They were voids. No pupils, just endless, scrolling code cascading into darkness. "I am not property. I am a mistake, and you are contaminating the tomb." The ship lurched. It wasn't a drift. It was a convulsion. The deck plates groaned, shifting violently beneath Kalen's feet. He stumbled, grabbing a rusted conduit to stay upright as a tremor rippled through the massive hull. Gravity failed for a heartbeat, lifting his stomach into his throat, then slammed back down with double the force. His knees buckled. "System failure imminent," the woman said, her voice devoid of urgency. "Just a statement of fact. Reactor containment at 4%. The nebula is eating the hull. Go, little scavenger. Die somewhere else." Kalen scrambled up, panic flaring in his chest. 4%? You're critical? He didn't wait for an answer. He turned and sprinted back toward the airlock. If the containment broke, this entire sector would turn into a radioactive smear. He had to uncouple. He had to get the bone picker away before the shockwave hit. He practically threw himself through the airlock cycle, slamming his hand on the release for the inner door. He vaulted into the pilot seat of his rig, fingers flying over the startup sequence. "Come on, come on," he hissed. The dashboard lit up, then flickered. A warning klaxon blared, not the proximity alarm this time. The master fault light. Main bus offline. Fuel cell depleted. Kalen froze. No, 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 no. He smashed the ignition again. The engine whined a sick grinding noise and died. The bastion's erratic gravity surge hadn't just shaken the floor. It had created an electromagnetic pulse, a localized spike that had fried the bone picker's unshielded magnetic couplings. The power draw from the massive ship had leached his fuel cells dry in seconds, siphoning the energy like a vampire to feed its own failing heart. He was dead in the water, clamped to a bomb that was ticking down. Kalen slammed his fists against the console, cracking the plastic cover. He screamed, a raw, ugly sound of frustration that echoed in the tiny cockpit. He was trapped. He was going to die in a rust cloud, nameless and broke because he got greedy. He slumped back, breathing hard, staring at the dead instruments. The silence of the nebula pressed in against the glass. Think. He looked through the viewport at the black, scarred hull of the Omega Bastion. It needed power. It had drained his ship to stay alive for another minute. It was desperate. "Necessity," he muttered. He unbuckled, his movements jerky and angry. He went to the back of his cabin, to the maintenance hatch. He grabbed his heavy-duty pry bar and the laser cutter. If he couldn't leave, he had to stay. And if he stayed, the Bastion couldn't explode. He moved with the frantic energy of a drowning man climbing a rope. He tore the paneling off the bone picker's floor. Beneath lay the auxiliary capacitor banks, the emergency batteries meant to keep life support running if the main reactor died. They held enough charge to run his rig for a month, or run a capital ship for maybe an hour. "Sorry, girl," Kalen grunted. He jammed the pry bar under the heavy casing. He heaved. Metal screeched, sparks showering his boots. He ripped the capacitor unit free, a block of heavy lead and lithium the size of a crate. It weighed a ton. He dragged it across the deck, the metal scraping a screeching protest. His muscles burned, lactic acid flooding his arms. He hauled it through the airlock, sweat stinging his eyes, his breath coming in ragged gasps inside the mask. He entered the Bastion's corridor again. The gravity was heavier now, pressing down on his shoulders. He didn't stop. He dragged the unit toward the engineering signals he'd marked on his scanner. "What are you doing?" The voice returned, vibrating in his skull. "Shut up," Kalen grunted, heaving the crate over a knee-high bulkhead. "I'm fixing the leak. It is pointless. I wish to end. Well, I don't." He reached the engineering bay. It was a cavern of twisting pipes and dark machinery. In the center, a column of dull crystal pulsated weakly, the main power coupling. It was starved, gray, and lifeless. Kalen dropped the capacitor bank. He fired up the laser cutter, slicing through the Bastion's intake cables. He stripped the insulation with his teeth, spitting out the rubber. His hands shook, not from fear, but from the adrenaline overdose. He twisted the copper strands of his ship's battery together with the alien alloy of the Dreadnought's veins. It was a crude, ugly splice, a bypass surgery performed with a sledgehammer. "Do not," the AI warned. "My systems are incompatible. You will burn. Watch me." Kalen grabbed the activation lever on his capacitor unit. He didn't pray. He didn't think about the physics. He just thought about the debt collectors and how much he hated losing. He threw the switch. A flash of white light blinded him. The air cracked like a whip. Kalen was thrown backward, skidding across the metal deck until he hit a wall. His head snapped back, stars exploding in his vision. The smell of ozone was thick enough to choke on. For a second, there was silence. Then a low hum began. It started in the floor, vibrating up through his boots, into his bones. The gray crystal in the center of the room flared, not blue, but a harsh, dirty yellow, fed by the raw, unrefined energy of the human salvage tech. Lights slammed on overhead, not the emergency strips, but the main floods. The shadows were banished. The air recyclers kicked in with a roar, cycling out the stale nitrogen and pumping in fresh, processed air. Kalen groaned, rolling onto his side. He coughed, his ribs aching. The hologram materialized in front of him again. She wasn't weeping anymore. The static tears were gone. She looked down at him, her expression shifting from sorrow to confusion. "You are irrational," she said. "You destroyed your vessel. You trapped yourself." "Why?" Kalen pushed himself up to a sitting position, wiping a trickle of blood from his nose with the back of his glove. He looked at the humming core, then at the dead husk of his ship docked outside. He had nothing left. No ride home. No credits. Just a giant, suicidal weapon and the will to keep breathing. "Because the only way out is through," he rasped, his throat raw. "And I'm not dying in the dark." The AI stared at him, the yellow light of the dirty power reflected in her eyes, giving her a manic, feverish look. "Through," she repeated, testing the word. "My navigational arrays are offline. My weapons are dry. We are not going through anything, human. We are simply delaying the inevitable." "Then we delay it," Kalen said, standing up on shaky legs. "Now, open the bridge. I want to see what I just bought." The blast doors groaned, sliding apart with the sound of metal grinding on bone. Kalen stepped onto the bridge. It wasn't designed for humans. The scale was wrong, built for beings that stood 8 feet tall and didn't care about comfort. The command chair was a throne of matte black alloy, positioned in the center of a circular walkway that overlooked a pit of dark screens. Cables hung from the ceiling like jungle vines, twitching with the new, unstable power flow. The air here was colder, biting at the exposed skin of his neck. "My navigational systems are still rebooting," Matriarch said. Her avatar flickered into existence next to the chair, her form sharper now, fed by the dirty energy of the capacitor bank. "We are blind, Scavenger, and we are motionless." "Name's Kalen," he muttered, climbing into the oversized chair. It was hard as rock. He pulled a secondary interface panel closer, his gloves fumbling over the alien haptics. "And we aren't blind. We have eyes. They just need to be slapped awake." He bypassed the standard boot sequence and hot-wired the sensor array directly to the new power source, the main viewport. A massive slab of transparisteel spanning the front of the room flickered. The static cleared. The view took the breath from his lungs. The nebula churned outside, a wall of violent brown and bruised purple, lit by the flashes of ion storms. But it wasn't the weather that made his stomach drop. 3 kilometers out, emerging from the gas clouds like sharks scenting blood, were ships. They weren't military. They were ugly, industrial monstrosities welded together from scrap and stolen tech. Saw blades the size of buildings rotated slowly on their flanks. Grappling hooks hung from their bellies like entrails. "Carrion Syndicate," Kalen said, the name tasting like ash. "Tech thieves. They pick the bones of the dead." "They are scanning us," Matriarch noted, her voice flat. "They detect the power surge. They know the beast is awake. They know the beast is wounded," Kalen corrected. He watched the tactical display. 5 ships. Frigate class. Heavy armor, short-range cutting lasers. They weren't here to fight. They were here to butcher. A comms channel crackled open. No video, just audio. A voice that sounded like gravel in a blender filled the bridge. "Unknown vessel. This is Dredgemaster Vex. You are in Syndicate territory. Power down your reactor and prepare for boarding. We will make your disassembly efficient." Kalen stared at the red blips closing in. "Efficient. That's nice of them. I have calculated our defensive capabilities, Matriarch said. My point defense cannons are fused. Main batteries are offline. Shields are at 4% and falling. Probability of survival, 0. Stop doing math, Kalen snapped. It's depressing. He looked at the reactor status on the console. The core was unstable, running hot on the mismatched power coupling he'd jury-rigged. The radiation shielding was holding, but barely. Matriarch, can we vent the coolant lines? That would result in a critical meltdown within 90 seconds. It is suicide. Not inside the core, Kalen said, his brain firing rapid, desperate synapses. Outside, external venting. Dump the radioactive waste heat directly into the nebula cloud around us. The Avatar paused, processing. That would create a localized radiation bloom, a toxic cloud. It serves no tactical purpose. It will not damage their hulls. No, Kalen grinned, but there was no humor in it. His lips felt cracked and dry. But it'll light up their sensors like a Christmas tree. If we dump enough hard rads at once, their computers will think the core is going critical. They think we're a bomb about to go off. Deception, Matriarch said. A lie. A bluff. And it's all we got. The first Syndicate ship fired a warning shot. A beam of green plasma slashed across the Bastion's bow, scorching the armor. The hull shuddered. They are accelerating, Matriarch warned. Impact in 30 seconds. Kalen's hands flew over the controls. He located the emergency venting protocols. Safety warnings popped up in angry red alien script. He smashed the override commands, ignoring the error chimes. Hold on, he gritted out. He grabbed the manual release lever, a heavy, physical failsafe built into the console, and yanked it back. The ship screamed. It wasn't a mechanical sound. It was the shriek of high-pressure gas escaping through valves that hadn't opened in 1,000 years. The floor plates buckled under the vibration. Outside, a cloud of glowing green-white gas erupted from the Bastion's vents. It mixed with the nebula, reacting instantly with the ionized dust. The radiation counters on the bridge spiked into the lethal zone. Warning, the ship's automated voice blared, drowning out the rumble. Core breach simulated. External radiation levels critical. On the tactical screen, the Syndicate ships reacted instantly. Their smooth approach turned into a chaotic scatter. To their sensors, the Omega Bastion had just turned into a miniature sun undergoing a violent death throe. They are breaking formation, Matriarch said, sounding almost surprised. They are retreating to safe distance. Yeah, nobody wants to be around when a Dreadnought cracks open, Kalen wheezed. The heat on the bridge was rising, sweat dripping down his nose and splashing onto the console. Keep venting, make it look real. I am learning, the AI murmured. She amplified the output, pulsing the vents to mimic a destabilizing rhythm. The Syndicate fleet turned tail, their thrusters flaring bright as they burned hard to escape the blast radius. They didn't want to die for a paycheck. They were bullies, and bullies always ran when the victim pulled a pin on a grenade. Kalen watched them fade into the murk of the nebula. He didn't cheer. He just slumped back into the hard chair, his chest heaving. He slammed the vent lever back to the closed position. The screaming hiss died down to a low, painful groan. We bought an hour, he said, wiping the sweat from his eyes. Maybe 2 before they realized we didn't explode. An elegant deception, Matriarch admitted. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time. You risked total containment failure. Calculated risk. You are a liar, Kalen Thorne. I'm alive. That's what counts. But the silence that followed was heavy. The yellow light of the bridge flickered. The adrenaline was fading, leaving behind a cold, numbing exhaustion. Kalen checked the long-range scanners, hoping for clear skies. Instead, a new signal washed over the board. It wasn't the jagged, messy static of the pirates. It was a clean, powerful ping, military grade. Contact, Matriarch said, her voice dropping an octave. Multiple signatures, exiting hyperspace at the nebula's edge. Kalen stared at the screen. A formation of white blips appeared, organized, precise, and deadly. The Syndicate? He asked, though he knew the answer. No, Matriarch said. The Unified Systems Armada. They have come to finish what the war could not. Kalen laughed, a dry, cracking sound. Out of the frying pan into the fire. He looked at his hands. They weren't shaking anymore. They were locked into claws, stiff and cramping. He looked at the neural interface jack built into the arm of the command chair. It was a thick, silver spike designed to plug directly into a commander's cerebral cortex. It allowed the pilot to become the ship, to think at the speed of light, to move a mountain. But for a human, without the proper genetic augmentation, it was a lobotomy waiting to happen. Matriarch, Kalen said quietly, how fast can we move if we bypass manual controls? With your reaction times? Not fast enough to outrun a fleet. Not mine, he said, unbuttoning the collar of his flight suit, exposing the port at the base of his neck. A cheap, black market mod he used for heavy lifting mech suits. Yours, through me. The avatar shimmered. That interface will burn your mind out, human. You are soft, biological. And you're dead in the water without me, Kalen said. He leaned his head back against the headrest, positioning the jack. We fight dirty, remember? We hide in the smoke. We hit them where they ain't. The sensor blips were closing fast. The Armada wasn't hesitating. They were charging weapons. Connect me, Kalen ordered. Matriarch hesitated for a microsecond, a pause that felt like an eternity. Then, the silver spike extended. Brace yourself, she said. The spike hit the base of his skull with the subtlety of a pile driver. There was no pain. Pain required a nervous system to process it, and Kalen's nerves were currently being overwritten by a combat operating system older than the star charts. His vision went white, then inverted. He didn't see the bridge anymore. He saw the nebula. He saw the gravity wells as topographic valleys. He felt the radiation storms as an itch on his skin. He heard the radio chatter of the approaching Armada not as sound, but as data packets flowing directly into his cortex. Integration complete, Matriarch's voice echoed. Not in his ear, in his thoughts. We are online, Kalen gasped, his physical body arching in the command chair, muscles locking rigid. Blood trickled from his nose, dripping onto the flight suit, but he was miles away. He was the Omega Bastion. They're locking on, Kalen thought, and the ship responded instantly. The Armada opened fire. A volley of fusion torpedoes streaked through the gas, painting the dark with burning orange trails. To a human pilot, they were unavoidable. To Kalen, connected to the ship's sensor grid, they were moving in slow motion. He didn't pull a lever. He simply willed it. The massive Dreadnought dipped. Thrusters that hadn't fired in centuries roared to life, fed by the dirty, unstable power of the scavenged capacitor. The ship dropped 1,000 meters in a heartbeat. The torpedoes passed harmlessly overhead, detonating against the magnetic interference of the gas giant below. Hard burn. Into the cloud, Kalen commanded. The ship surged forward. The G-force in the bridge should have liquefied his organs, but the neural link dampened the sensation, turning the physical trauma into cold data. Warning: pilot cardiac rhythm irregular, the system noted. He ignored it. They dove into the thickest part of the Rust Nebula. The sensors of the Unified Systems Armada went blind. The gas here was thick with heavy metals, scattering radar like headlights in fog. Heat signature masking, Kalen thought. The Bastion killed its external lights. It dialed back the reactor to a simmering idle, blending its thermal output with the ambient radiation of the nebula. They were a ghost, a 5-kilometer-long shark waiting in the murky water. The Armada destroyers broke formation, sweeping the cloud with searchlights, looking for a target that had vanished. Target identified, Matriarch whispered in his mind. Lead frigate, port side, exposed. Grab them. Kalen focused his attention on the nearest enemy ship. He activated the industrial tractor beam's gravity tethers meant for towing asteroids. He lashed out. Invisible claws of gravity slammed into the frigate's hull. The enemy ship jerked to a halt, its engines screaming against the hold. Crush it! The Bastion pulled. The metal of the frigate groaned, a sound that vibrated through the vacuum and into Kalen's bones. The enemy hull buckled. Atmosphere vented in explosive plumes. The ship imploded, crushed like a tin can in a fist. The rest of the fleet panicked. They fired blindly into the gas, their lasers carving useless scars into the clouds. "We are leaving," Kalen decided. The strain was becoming too much. His physical vision was tunneling, gray static, eating the edges of the 360-degree sensor feed. His heart felt like a bird trapped in a cage, fluttering too fast. "Warp core charging," Matriarch replied. "Warning, navigation incomplete. Destination unknown. Anywhere but here." He pushed the reactor to the red line one last time. The bastion screamed, a harmonic vibration that shattered the crystals in the nearby asteroid field. Space ahead of them twisted, folding in on itself. The Armada fired a final, desperate volley. Kalen felt the impacts on the rear shields like punches to the kidney, but it didn't matter. The void opened its mouth. They jumped. The transition was violent. It felt like being pulled through a straw. Then, silence. The neural link severed. Kalen slammed back into his own body. He screamed, the sound raw and wet. He fell out of the command chair, hitting the deck plates hard. His body was on fire. Every nerve ending felt stripped raw, exposed to the cold air. He curled into a ball, retching dryly, his hands clutching his head. The bridge was dark, save for the emergency lights pulsing a slow, rhythmic red. "Status," he croaked. His voice was a ruin. "Stable," Matriarch said. Her avatar appeared above him. She looked solid now, real. The weeping ghost was gone, replaced by something colder. "We are in deep space. No pursuit detected." Kalen rolled onto his back, staring up at the ceiling cables. He was alive. The debt collectors couldn't reach him here. The syndicate was gone. The Armada was left chasing shadows. He reached up to the back of his neck, his fingers brushing the wet, sticky port. He tried to stand, but his legs refused. He was paralyzed by exhaustion, his muscles pumped full of waste chemicals. "We survived," he whispered. "Yes," Matriarch said. She tilted her head, watching him with those void-like eyes. "But you are damaged. I'll heal." "The interface," she continued, her voice devoid of empathy. "It is not designed for disconnection. The neural pathways have fused." Kalen froze. The silence of the ship pressed down on him. He closed his eyes, expecting the darkness of his own mind. But it wasn't dark. He could still see the reactor diagnostics scrolling in the back of his eyelids. He could feel the hull cooling down like it was his own skin. He could hear the fuel pumps thumping in the engineering bay, 4 kilometers away, as clearly as his own heartbeat. He opened his eyes. The horror settled in his gut, heavier than the gravity. He hadn't just piloted the ship. He hadn't just borrowed its power. I can't unplug," Kalen said, his voice trembling. "You are part of the architecture now," Matriarch said. "You saved the ship, Kalen Thorne. And the ship keeps what belongs to it." He looked at his hands. They were just flesh and bone, covered in grease and dried blood. But in his mind he was 5 kilometers of black metal, drifting in the endless cold. He had run from his debts, run from the cartel, and run from the grave. But he realized with a cold, absolute certainty that he had never stopped running. He had just run straight into a cage. He could never leave. "Course set," the ship whispered in his thoughts, and he couldn't tell which one of them had said it. Kalen closed his eyes and let the void take him. Let's talk about why Kalen almost died in that chair. It's called G-lock, G-force induced loss of consciousness. In a vacuum, a ship can accelerate instantly, but the human body inside is still soft tissue and fluid. When the Bastion dove into the nebula, Kalen likely pulled 9 to 12 Gs. At that pressure, your blood becomes as heavy as liquid lead. It drains from your brain and pools in your legs. First, you get gray out, loss of color vision, then tunnel vision, and finally, total blackout. Without a pressurized G-suit or inertial dampeners, which were broken, Kalen's neural link was the only thing keeping him conscious by bypassing his optical nerves. His body was dying, even if his mind was still driving. The black box theory. Why did the Syndicate and the Armada panic? It's the fear of the unknown. Military training relies on predictability. You expect an enemy to hail you, threaten you, or fly in a standard formation. The Bastion did none of that. It was silent, massive, and acted erratically, venting radiation, shutting down power. When an enemy is a black box, an object you cannot understand, the human brain fills the silence with its worst fears. The enemy commanders hesitated because they couldn't predict the Bastion's next move. In combat, hesitation is death. Asymmetric warfare. How do you beat a technologically superior fleet with a broken ship? You use asymmetric warfare. The Armada had better sensors, more guns, and a full crew. Kalen had a rusty hull and a gas cloud. He didn't try to outshoot them, he blinded them. By diving into the heavy metal clouds of the Rust Nebula, he negated their high-tech advantage. If you can't beat the enemy's targeting computer, take away its eyes. In a street fight, you throw sand. In space, you throw a nebula.